Hi, and welcome to another of Mrs. Amen's video lectures. Today we're going to talk about premises. And the reason we're going to talk about premises is because I use the term in reference and in replacement of thesis. So, why are we going to talk about them anyways? Well, first off, writing is a very important component to history. It's used for persuasive essays, speeches, analyzing documents, debating. And you have to start thinking a little bit, at least, in terms of history as being a component of the English branch. History is kind of the non-fiction branch. It's really not enough to just gaze at facts, but those facts need to be analyzed and then they need to be interpreted. So, premises will help us do that, both by understanding how they work in conversation and in documents, but also how to use them. So let's begin. Let's start out with what is a premise. Now, the best place to start would be to look in the dictionary, which I've done for you. So, premise as a noun means a previous statement or presumption from which another is inferred or follows as a conclusion. In clearer terms, we could say it's an assumption from which another assumption follows naturally as its conclusion. As a verb, to premise upon something is to base an argument, a theory, or undertaking on. It's also a state, or to presuppose something to be a premise. So, basically what we're looking for is a type of theory that infers another theory. Premise versus thesis. So what exactly is a thesis? Well, a thesis is a statement or theory that's put forth as a premise to be maintained or proved. And so if you notice in this definition, premise is a key term. So in order to understand thesis, we first need to understand premise, a presumption which makes another presumption as the natural conclusion. So a thesis statement's actually pretty much a premise. The paper itself is the thesis, hence why we say thesis statement, because the statement will then therefore be proved throughout the paper. So, okay, so what? Why should I care about all this? Well, let's take a look at premises in more depth. Premises tend to be pretty sneaky, mainly because all people are biased in some way. So, anytime they make an inference and are stating something beyond an actual proven fact, like 1 + 1 = 2. I mean, there's not a lot of premises behind that idea. But overall, once you interpret what that 2 is, that's when a premise comes into place. So because people are already biased, that means anything they do, all their work, because once they actually put all those facts into a paper or into a statement, it becomes automatically biased. And obviously, diaries, newspapers, those kinds of things are easy to notice bias and to notice the premise. But maps and mathematical data also can be biased. So let's start with those because those are probably the most difficult to identify premises, but at the same time, you need to be able to identify those premises. So, let's just take a look at a simple example. Which of these two maps are the correct map? This one? Or this one? Now think about that for a second and try to jot down an answer. What do you think's the correct one and why? Or are they both correct? So let's take a look at these maps again. Well, what's the correct answer? The fact is, they both are correct. And the reason for this is you have to keep in mind that Earth floats in space. And in space, there's no up or down, top or bottom, left or right. That sense of space and directionals don't exist out in space. So therefore, there really can't be a top or a bottom, a correct side and a wrong side. So first let's examine where the premise begins. And it starts with the words, top or bottom, right side up and upside down. And if you think about the term top, it's actually a loaded term. Consider being on top of the world. That's a really good thing. That's when we're, at our best, at the peak of our current perception of ourselves. Being on the bottom, or bottoming out, or rock bottom, those things are really negative terms in terms of how we perceive where we're at. So those are the worst connotations. And right side up and upside down, when things are all upside down, you're confused, it's an awful state of being. And since those terms are loaded, we tend to organize the map in a similar fashion. So let's look at the differences in these maps in terms of who's on top and who's on bottom. In the map in the upper left-hand corner, we have South America, Australia, Africa, China and India, and Mexico being on top, and the Euro-centered world being on the bottom. In the standard map that we're pretty much all used to, we have the US and Canada, and Russia and Europe, kind of the white Euro-centered world being on the top. And why is that? Well, it was Europeans who originally made the maps in mass quantities and kind of put them out for the world, and have just adopted them that way for the most part. It hasn't been until recently that the upper left-hand map has started to come into use, and it's typically used in more southern countries for the fact that politically gaining some personal power, because why shouldn't they be on top? Who's to say they are really on the bottom? So, and that's really about benefits. Who considers who on top of the world? Statistical data bias. Now these are less obvious and than maps even, because, I mean, even with maps, how you draw it, how big the country is, etc., etc. Those are also by premises put forward by each map. But statistical data is not as obvious. So let's start with a quote by Mark Twain. There are three kinds of lies. Lies, damned lies, and statistics. So why is he feeling this way? Well, let's take a look at statistical data in general. At first, the data is in and of itself just numbers. But it's once you interpret those numbers that things become gray. So, how those numbers are both collected, arranged, also play into the premise put forth, and then later can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. In fact, people often use the same data to prove two different issues, and it's the exact same information, but they can flip it. And what order you decide to put it in can make a big, big difference. So let's start this analysis of statistical data and how it can be already biased and already contain a premise with IQ testing. IQ testing, of course, is being able to test people for who's got the best brains or whatnot, who's the smartest and who's not as smart. And throughout history, we have found that IQ testing is not a science. It's actually very, very temperamental, and it's all dependent upon who's giving the test and what kinds of questions they ask and who's taking the test, and do they have access to the knowledge from their own culture and their own language. So if I gave you an IQ test in German, obviously everyone in this room would, who's listening to this, unless you speak fluent German, is going to fail it. So that would be one, and that was one way they used to test incoming immigrants into this country, and then they would label them very negatively, of course, you can imagine, based on those IQ tests. But the fact was, they were giving the IQ test in English, and the person speaks maybe Russian or Polish or German or whatever, Italian, and so they, of course, couldn't test well. But there's also just, even if you can read the language, we'll look at an example of how that can not be as easy as it seems. So let's take a little example here. I'm not going to tell you where this test comes from, but I would like you to give your best guess to to answer these questions. So the first question, what number comes next in the sequence? 1, 2, 3, blank. Second question, as wallaby is to animal, so cigarette is to blank. Take a second, write down your best guess, and we'll switch to the answers. Well, if you are an Australian Aborigine, I'm sure you did great on this test. Of course, if you're not, well, that's a whole nother story, right? So the first question was 1, 2, 3, many. And the reason that is because they really don't go beyond many in terms of their number systems. Many can mean anything from 4 to 1,000, really. They just don't have words for it. So if you answered 4, yeah, in English that's correct, in American English, in American society, but in Australia, with the Aborigines, not so much. Second question, the right answer is actually tree. This stems from the idea that Australian Aborigine speakers usually experience the idea of tobacco with the idea of stick, hence it's classified with a tree. So that might not have been as obvious to you, mainly because you don't live there. So of course, collecting that data, if we were just to collect the answers there, we could probably see that most of us failed this test. And does that mean your IQ is low? Obviously not. You just didn't grow up in Australia, so how could you have possibly known those answers? So that's collecting data where it can make interpretation can change drastically. Another example I'd like to provide you with is from referencing data, to interpret data in two different sort of ways. And writer Ray Raphael, who's written a great book called The People's History of the American Revolution, wrote an article for the Zinn Education Project. And he talks about how using numbers are problematic in terms of the American Revolution because textbooks will use them one way that's beneficial towards the viewpoint of Americans and their relationship with African Americans and slaves at the time. And so they'll skew the numbers. And take a listen to how they do that. Most texts do mention African Americans' participation in the war, but they focus primarily on those who sided with the Americans. In fact, those who sided with the British were far more numerous, but you'd never guess it from reading the text. When they offer numbers, they typically compare the estimated number of black Patriot soldiers during the course of the entire war, 5,000, with the number of enslaved people who sought freedom with the British in a single week, generally cited as 300. The myth of the patriotic slave is not far removed from that of the happy slave. So, when texts want to give the viewpoint of America being so much nicer to the slaves during the war, they will cite these numbers kind of backwards. And it gives you this kind of perception that, oh, well, look at all these, African-American slaves at the time who were fighting for the Patriots, but obviously more were fighting for the British. So that's how numbers can be used as premises. So what to remember? 1. Humans are always humans. They are conditioned by their environment, and they can only access what they actually know. 2. Words, statements, and questions always, always, always contain unspoken and spoken biases. 3. It is our job as historians and as people who need to make good informed decisions on just an everyday basis, need to uncover those biases and see if they work for us. So let's take a look at the easiest form, statements, statement premises. So example 1. We're going to look at a historical example from Paul von Hindenburg, who was the second president of Germany in 1925, where he states, without colonies, no security regarding the acquisition of raw materials. Without raw materials, no industry. Without industry, no adequate standard of living and wealth. Therefore, Germans, do we need colonies? So, what's the premise in this particular statement? Let's start breaking it down. First off, it automatically presumes that only industrial society can provide a good living and a good wealth. We can see that where he says, with no industry, no adequate standard of living and wealth. So he's just assuming that only industrial societies can provide a comfortable living. And whatever wealth may mean in this case. And that's, of course, a loaded term as well. And we can just assume and presume from this statement that he's really talking about money. 2, that people need to go out and take, by force or coercion, things from others. So, we need colonies in order to maintain our lifestyle and security. So therefore, we need to go take over other people's land, other people who are living there, using those resources, etc., etc. It's our right to do so, because we need it for ourselves. 3, that raw materials are nothing more than things, and we can just go around taking them for our own desires. That they, in fact, maybe mean more than just what people need, but that ecosystems in and of themselves have those needs. But because from this statement we can see that he doesn't presume to care about that part, he just presumes to care that we can go around taking whatever we want and that raw materials are fair game. 4, that Germans want an industrial society. So in this whole statement, it's the assumption that industrial society is the goal. That all Germans must want that. Because he's using the term we. We need them. Who exactly is this we, anyways? Is it all Germans who want industrial society? Do all Germans benefit from industrial society? We don't know based on this statement. This statement's from one man's point of view, and this is his point of view. This is his premise about these issues. Example 2, question premises. These are a little sneakier because they are couched in a question. So what ends up happening, most people, very human people, immediately when presented with a question, have been trained from birth to answer the question, rather than think about its particular meaning and what the premise behind that is. And do you want to buy that particular idea? Maybe it's not in your best benefit to buy that idea. So let's take a look at a more modern day example, one that we're currently being bombarded with. How are we going to fix the economic problem? Well, there's several premises couched in this one statement. Oh, in this one question, really. So let's take a look at what those are. First off, and most important, don't answer the question when you look for these. Do not answer the question. That's not the point of this. We're looking at what is the idea this question is trying to sell you. Second, we're going to look at the whole question and start asking some other questions. Third, we want to dissect all pronouns. Pronouns are super, super sneaky, just as premises are. So they kind of hide themselves. And I think you saw it a little bit in that last example, but let's go a little further. First, it presumes that there is a problem. So we want to ask, why is it the speaker seems to think that there is an economic problem? Who's to say that the way this economic system is currently working isn't already supposed to work that way? That maybe its rise and fall is actually part of the system. Second off, it presumes that we want to fix it, that we like the economic system the way it is and the way it had been, and we want to go back to it. That all people want that. That's not necessarily true, and we may be starting to really think, well, could we go to a different model? But it's not asking us to do that. It's just asking us to fix the current economic problem. Thirdly, and most importantly, who exactly is we? Am I going to do this? Are you? Is it the government? Who do they mean when they say we? Are they talking about upper class, middle class, lower class? These are very, very important concepts that need to be figured out. And basing on who, of course, says the statement will provide a lot of clues to that. But the fact is, that's something we want to ask so we can figure out, well, exactly who is this we? last example, example 3, word premises. And these tend to be probably the most unobvious to us because our language has been so embedded in us. We tend not to think about why the words that we use, why are we using them and choosing them to describe certain things or ideas. But they're worth investigating, and especially when you're working with documents and analyzing speeches and all sorts of writing, we have to look at the word choice specifically to uncover a lot of the meaning. So let's take a look at 2 different examples. Primitive versus civilized. Primitive in the Webster Dictionary says, having a quality or style that offers an extremely basic level of comfort, convenience, or efficiency. With this stated, it makes it sound like anything that is primitive is in some way bad, that it's low levels of comfort and convenience, that you're not going to be happy in your situation, that it's not very in-depth or intelligent. Whereas civilized, bringing a place or a people to a stage of social, cultural, and moral development, considered to be more advanced. Well, when we say more advanced, in this particular definition, we tend to think of better. You're more socially advanced. You can get along better. You work together better. Culturally, you are more intellectual. You have better art. You have a better language. And morally, you're higher in terms of how you deal with situations, that you're going to be more righteous, in other words. But that's not necessarily true, and we can take civilized as such a good one to work with. Socially advanced, would you say that we get along better? I mean, if that's true, then why did we develop the nuclear bomb? Or machine weapons, or high-powered killing devices? I would say that's not a very good example of being more advanced socially. How about culturally? Has the art or the writing or the literature or the stories been more advanced? You can easily look at so-called primitive cultures and find extraordinary depth in their writings and their language even, that our cultures struggle to even begin with or to understand. And moral development? So we are kinder, or that we are more giving and more generous? Well, how many people are starving in the world and living on $2 a day or less? Is that us being more morally advanced? Or is that actually the opposite? And in this case, is an advancement in moral development actually mean the increase of greed and self-righteousness and the displacement of power, giving it to one group over another? That's really questionable. So, when we're looking at readings or writings, we have to look for these ideas, these premises. What is being hidden and couched in there that's offering a further conclusion? Something that's taking us to the next stage. So, with these examples, if I call somebody civilized, it seems to be that I'm calling them better. And that I chose that term for that reason. But it's not necessarily the case. And so I hope as you proceed through history in this class, and even when you're not in history class and you're listening to a politician or a writer or another group, that you first look at the premises and then decide, do you agree? Because you might agree. But first, you need to make that decision. You need to find out what is it they're trying to sell you. So, please keep that in mind as we go through the year. Thank you for listening to this video lecture. It was great having you around, and I hope you gained new insight into the world.